Hello everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Holland Land Office Museum's Artifact video series. My name is Ryan Duffy and I'm the director of the museum. And this week we are going to talk about a very early event in Western New York's history, going all the way back to the Revolutionary War, and that is the Sullivan Expedition into central and western New York. Now, the impetus behind this expedition during the Revolutionary War is that many tribes of the Six Nations of the Iroquois, including the Seneca, were conducting raids on frontier settlements throughout Pennsylvania and New York, and this was causing a lot of chaos throughout the area and depriving the Continental Army of food and supplies and forcing troops away from the main battles to help protect the frontier. In response to this, General George Washington in 1779 put together a plan in order to strike at the heart of the Iroquois and essentially take away their power in the area and force them off of the frontier areas. And this goal was given to General John Sullivan, and his second in command would be General John Clinton. So the point was to destroy any Indian settlements and destroy any crops or necessary resources for them, and to strike fear into them, force them into quote-unquote good behavior, which would last well into the future, long after the war. This would be done through taking of hostages and basically a scorched earth campaign. Now, the plan of the expedition was actually twofold, with Sullivan taking the main bulk of the force up the Susquehanna River through Pennsylvania and come up to New York from the south, eventually reaching at a place called Tioga, which is near modern-day Chemung, right on the New York-Pennsylvania border, while Clinton would take his force through New York and eventually meeting up within the Finger Lakes region. And he was to begin in the Mohawk Valley. Now, the force comprised of about 4,500 men, including Army regulars, militia, and some Native American allies, particularly some Delaware and Oneida warriors who would help out as they were loyal to the colonist cause. Now, out of all the Iroquois, there was a split between allegiances, and this actually turned out to be almost a civil war amongst the Iroquois, as the bulk of the Six Nations supported the British, though some parts remained neutral, and other parts actually supported what would become the colonial army. So you had different factions of the Iroquois fighting on each side and often against each other. Now, Sullivan's part of the expedition sets off first and works its way up through the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania without much resistance, and is able to take a lot of salvage goods that they could use along their trip, and very laden with baggage, and eventually reaches around Tioga. And it is in this general area that the only major battle of the campaign takes place, and this is the Battle of Newtown. Now, the Battle of Newtown was odd in the sense that the Native American tribes actually decided to stand and fight instead of employing their usual guerrilla tactics, which had been working so well up until this point. And the British commander of the Loyalist forces, Colonel John Butler, was exasperated at this point because he pushed for them to continue the guerrilla tactics that he and his men and his Native American allies had done to such great effect. But he really could not go against the wishes of his Native American allies, as they were the bulk of his forces. So they stood and fought at Newtown and tried to lay out a trap for the marching American forces, but the ambush was found out ahead of time by scouting Americans, and they were able to force the Native Americans out from their positions with artillery and cause tremendous casualties, and took very little in the way back in terms of casualties. So the Battle of Newtown is much less a battle as it is a rout, where the forces under Sullivan were able to easily dispatch the Native American and Loyalist forces in front of them, though this would just be a precursor to the expedition's final goal. Now, Sullivan pushed up from the south and Clinton pushed from the east, and their main final objective was to actually reach Fort Niagara and cleanse it as a loyalist stronghold and a fortress of Native American raids in the area. However, they did not eventually reach that goal, but the expedition did reach many of its other goals. Between Clinton and Sullivan's forces, they continued to push through central New York into towards the Genesee River and burned well over 40 settlements along with all their crops and belongings, and were able to basically force out thousands of Senecas from their homes and push them farther and farther west beyond the Genesee River and more into the protection of Fort Niagara. Even though the Continental Army was on a path of destruction, it did take some time to stop and look and wonder at the marvel of the Native American settlements that they had passed through and eventually destroyed, as they were very different than what their expectations were. Most of these settlements were well developed, with even wood-framed houses that rivaled those in the American settlements, along with well-cultivated gardens and very well upkept, which surprised many of the soldiers, as their image of the savage was well ingrained, and this definitely took them aback, though it did not stop them from destroying them in the process. Colonel Butler of the British Loyalist forces attempted to rally his Native American allies again. He tried to convince them to protect Canandaigua, which was his main base of operations, though they were very hesitant to stand and fight with the American forces again. But he was able to convince them to at least lay an ambush for the forces as they were coming closer and closer to the Genesee Valley. And one of those positions actually caught an advance party of scouting American forces that were returning from their mission. Now, this ambush took place near modern-day Cuylerville, and a force of about 400 Native Americans and Loyalists ambushed a small scouting party of about 25 men, and only a few were able to escape, with 2 American soldiers taken prisoner, including the commanding officer, Lieutenant Boyd, and their Native American guide. The Native American guide was killed outright, but the 2 Americans were meant to be taken back to Fort Niagara as prisoners. However, on their way there, they were taken from their armed guards by the local Native Americans and were actually tortured and mutilated to death, which has raised a legend of the torture tree. By mid-September, Sullivan had reached Geneseo, or Little Beardstown, which was one of the major settlements for the Senecas in the Genesee Valley. And it was here that probably the largest scene of destruction happened, as they destroyed all 128 houses as well as the extensive fields that surround it, and basically dismantled the Seneca power in the Genesee Valley with the destruction of Geneseo, which is near modern-day Geneseo today. However, this is where the expedition would stop, even though its initial goal was to make it all the way to Fort Niagara. As fall was starting to kick in, I believe Sullivan, who was also in ailing health, did not think it was worth it to go any farther, and he also had this misconception that there were no other major settlements of the Senecas beyond the Genesee Valley, which was completely false. So he decided to turn around and head back the way he came, eventually going all the way back down to Fort Sullivan down in the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania, and then eventually in the winter returning to New Jersey. By the end of September, there were nearly 5,000 Native American refugees who had flocked to Fort Niagara to seek British assistance and shelter, which nearly brought famine to the garrison, though they were able to avoid this only narrowly. But it essentially destroyed the independence of the Six Nations of the Iroquois and forced them into dependence on the British, which the British were not interested in, and basically abandoned them by the end of the war. Now, the expedition was a success from the colonial perspective, though it failed to reach many of its main goals. The first, it never reached Fort Niagara, and second, it never had many captives taken, which was another one of the main goals, was to bring back Native American captives. though probably the main goal was to essentially take the heart out of these Six Nations and their willingness to fight. And this was accomplished by the destroying of 40 settlements and thousands of bushels of grains and vegetables and other crops that were necessary for the Native Americans of the area to survive. And it essentially showed to the local tribes that this continued raiding would not be tolerated, though it ended up having somewhat of an adverse effect as the forces were indiscriminate in their destruction, and many of the tribes in the areas were neutral, had not chosen a side, and this inevitably turned them against the American cause as they sought, rightly we could say, revenge against the forces that had destroyed their homes and livelihoods. And all this destruction only cost the American forces about 40 men, so they were able to do this at a very low casualty rate, and essentially all of those came from Boyd's scouting party that was ambushed. The Native American raids would return, though, in 1780 with greater ferocity against the frontier areas as the fires of war had come to their homeland, so they returned them in kind. So in the end, the expedition is sort of a hollow victory in the sense that it did accomplish its goals, but it did not keep them very long and really failed to break the back, but at least it gave them some time and some breathing room and forced particularly the Iroquois to sort of take a step back, and they now had to rely on the British ever more, which was not something either side really wanted. Now, we do have an artifact going back, not necessarily to Sullivan's expedition, but at least at that time period. We have a drum here from the Revolutionary War. So here is the drum, Revolutionary War drum. This was carried by Benjamin Crowell, who was a Revolutionary War soldier, who eventually made his way farther into western New York, though we don't have any proof that he was part of the Sullivan Expedition. But there were a lot of land grants given to Revolutionary War soldiers, which is probably what brought him closer to our area. And this was a rather large drum that would often be used in battle by forces of the time, and this drum would have been the main communication device during battle, as this is long before radios and telephones. And in the smoke of battle, usually a drum was the only way to communicate orders to the soldiers. And it might be difficult to tell from your viewing here, but this drum is actually a little bit oblong, and this is because it was actually carried by someone before Crowell, and that soldier was actually killed while carrying it and fell on top of the drum, which actually caused it to be a little lopsided. But this is one of our artifacts, the most prominent one from the time period of the Sullivan Expedition. Though we can't connect it directly, it still is a very good representation of something that would have been used during the time period there. So I hope you enjoyed this edition of our Artifact video series. In case you've missed any in the past, please go check out our YouTube channel, Holland Land Office Museum, and you can catch all of the rest of them. I believe this is our 43rd one we've done, so it's been going on for quite a while, and we're going to keep working at them to get them out every week to everybody. And we hope that you've enjoyed them and stick with us in the future.